Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the lodger was veiled, the face was yellow, and the valley was fearsome, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder what kind of medical practice Dr. Watson actually ran? Or about the number of Holmes's monographs? Or how much the rent was at 221B Baker Street?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 276, Trees, Part 2, Branching Out. Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into some of the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, I'm going to go out on a limb here, but are you ready for this episode?
Yes, I'm well planted and half sawed off, so it's all fine.
Excellent. Well, while I do the housekeeping here, you can just leaf through your notes. Sorry. The episode notes, if you would like to look up any links that we may have or mention during the show, can be found at ihose.co/trifles276, all lowercase. That'll take you directly to our show's website, which, if you're new to the area, is sherlockholmespodcast.com. If you'd like to get in touch with us for any reason, you can always email us. We are trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. And we, of course, are I Hear of Sherlock on most of the major social networks, if you'd like to check us out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube. We do appreciate your support, and we've been hearing from people from all over the web, and we have been receiving a lot of support as well on Patreon. So take a look around on the homepage there, see what strikes your fancy, get in touch with us, and become part of this amazing and growing community. Well, Bert, the last time we were here talking about something botanical, it was Trees Part 1, where we went over the oak and under the elm. This is the second part of that series. We couldn't cover all of the major trees that we wanted to mention in a single episode. And these all, of course, come from a publication called The Botanical Holmes, a monograph on plants in the time of Sherlock Holmes by Donald Gerard Jewell. This is the fifth, I think, or sixth in the Sherlock Holmes Natural History series. It's a wonderful series if you can locate it. Typically in used bookstores or sites, you'll find an occasional stray volume here and there. It's difficult to find the entire run, but if you can find any one of them, pick them up, because they are just a wonderful read, not only to understand exactly what happened in the stories or what was mentioned in the stories, but to understand the context during the Victorian and Edwardian times. I think Mr. Jewell does a fine job on that, and we're going to continue our romp through the forest. And Bert, since my copy is missing a page, actually is missing 4 pages because it's front to back and it's stapled through. So page 30 and 31 and pages 40 and 41 are missing. So I'm going to rely on you to set us up here.
That is, it makes it a very rare copy. You've got, talk about a misprint. Woo! I think this is headed right for the auction house.
Well, maybe the tree that was involved objected to being included in this volume.
Well, as we've said before, the lovely thing, one of the many lovely things about this is you get somebody like Don Jewell, who has this deep interest, this deep professional and personal interest in the natural world, and produces over a period of years these intense but interesting volumes relating his own interests to the cases of Sherlock Holmes. What's going on? Well, at this point in the Botanical Holmes, we're up to a section of the book he calls, and I guess you're going to immediately be able to determine which tree we're going to be talking about. He calls this section the best of the beeches. And he's read, it seems to me, Don Jewell has just read everything in preparing this. He refers to a book called, of course, I'm astonished this is not on my shelf, The Natural History of Selborne, of course. I'm sure many of you right now are turning to your own copies of this. He says, the author Gilbert White called the beech tree the most lovely of all forest trees. And it's well represented in the Canon. Now, of course, you'd think immediately we'd be getting to copper beeches, but no. Don Jewell says, how about the Musgrave ritual? Reginald Musgrave points out, almost apologetically to Holmes, that although he did not have any other old elms, there were plenty of beeches on the property. And also in Sign of Four, the corner of the wall around Pondicherry Lodge was screened by a young beech. And in the Boscombe Valley mystery, Holmes examined the bark of a beech, the largest tree in the neighborhood, which helped him solve the case. And then in Valley of Fear, the manor house of Burleston stood in an old park famous for its large beech trees. What a wonderful forest that must have been. When the adventure took place, the smooth gray beech bark would have stood out from the brown landscape as it reflected the sun's rays. And in spring and summer, the dense foliage of those same trees would prevent the light from ever reaching the forest floor, because the shade cast by the beech is the deepest of any broad-leaved tree in that region. And this was one reason why there would have been so little undergrowth at Burleston. The roots feed close to the surface and make it impossible for other plants to grow under beeches. Well, and then Don tells us, a good deal about more about the common beech, and tells us it grows as high as 100 feet, can have a girth of up to 20 feet. It's indigenous to England, and there's a purple variety, which originated in the Hohenlieder forest of Germany sometime in the 18th century. And it's this tree that is also known as the copper beech. And there, at last we're there, a clump of copper beeches grows immediately in front of the door to the Rucastle home in Winchester. And Watson describes their dark leaves shining like burnished metal in the light of the setting sun.
Well, and that strikes me as interesting. With the copper beeches, it's a variety of the beech here. Is there any other story that is named for a tree?
Well, there are. I don't know if there's any story, but Don points out here that there are trees. So, for example, he says, aside from the beech and the lime, elm, and oak, we've already talked about, you can include the chestnut, larch, the Scots pine, the Scots fir, the yew tree, so on. Trees do lend their names to dwellings.
Yes, they do.
And, we've got, was it Laburnum Lodge?
Where was that?
That was Josiah Brown.
Oh, right.
That was Josiah Brown's house.
Yeah, and the myrtles from the Greek Interpreter.
Right. Laburnum Lodge or Laburnum Villa.
Yeah. And
is situated in Laburnum Vale.
Yeah.
And that's because laburnums were numerous in that part of Chiswick.
Okay.
Chiswick, he says, yeah.
And then we had, didn't Neville Sinclair live at the Cedars? And the Man with the Twisted Lip?
Right.
So, yeah, so we have houses, and certainly there are a number of Sherlock Holmes stories named for houses, names of houses. The Abbey Grange comes to mind. But the Copper Beeches is the one that gets the tree directly. So, interesting nod there to that particular type of tree.
Yeah. And then we're off to the myrtle tree, Notophagus cunninghami. Grows in Australia and Tasmania, but it is rather unlikely, he says, this was the plant which lent its name to the myrtles beckenum in the Greek Interpreter, because Watson describes the house as large and dark but makes no mention of the landscaping. There could have been myrtle growing there, but of course that's not a tree. It's more like a hothouse plant, a shrub, 10 to 15 feet shrub. Interesting.
And he says the owners of such plants were rewarded not only by its evergreen leaves, but by its fragrant flowers as well. Ironically, the myrtle was the symbol of love and was frequently used in Victorian bridal bouquets. Now, Sophie Cratides probably would have had something to say about that.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we take this moment to get to the root of our support? You see what I did there? And have this quick word from our sponsor. The Baker Street Journal was first published in 1946, and its old series extended through 1949. It picked up again in 1951 and has been publishing ceaselessly every quarter since then. Every issue of the BSJ is packed with top-notch papers that reflect the sensibilities of Sherlockians from throughout the world. They might be scholarly in nature, giving us details on an aspect of Victorian life that maybe we weren't aware of. They might be tongue-in-cheek, that approach to the game where we wink at each other as we acknowledge Dr. Watson as the true author of the stories and try to figure out some inconsistency. Or they might be something that we never thought was related to Sherlock Holmes, and the author brings it all together for us. Whatever the approach, they're all represented in the Baker Street Journal. Plenty of varying opinions and researches on the world of Sherlock Holmes. Make sure you get on the subscription list to get your copy of the Baker Street Journal delivered to your mailbox every quarter by going to bakerstreetirregulars.com today. All right, we are back, and we're in the midst of the forest here talking about, myrtles and copper beeches. And, Bert, as we move on to our next tree, I'm trying to remember if this was remarked as a color of someone's hair. The chestnut. Sure. The chestnut tree is mentioned in two stories, but do we recall chestnut being used as a descriptor for anyone's hair color?
Oh, sure, absolutely. In the Copper Beeches, it's Violet Hunter, who is asked to trim her chestnut hair before she takes on this bizarre position with the Rucastle family.
Wow, that's interesting. So that really, I don't know, Conan Doyle must have been on a horticultural kick when he wrote that episode, or that story. Chestnut hair in the Copper Beeches.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, today, I have the sense that in short fiction today, that you don't have let's put it this way, that it's more distinctive in short fiction in the late 19th, early 20th century to find a great intersection with things involving the natural world, is much more prevalent than in modern short fiction. But now, having come up with this deep observation and thought about it for a second, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? I mean, the world is a lot more built up 100 years later.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Certainly. But as we delve into the stories, we find the chestnut tree mentioned in Wisteria Lodge and the yellow face. Interesting, in the yellow face, Watson gives us a very good description. One day, He writes, in early spring, we had so far relaxed as to go for a walk with me in the park. He had so far relaxed as to go for a walk with me in the park, where the first faint shoots of green were breaking out upon the elms, and the sticky spearheads of the chestnuts were beginning to burst into their five-fold leaves. Wow. And Jewel does a wonderful thing here. He says, thanks to Watson's careful description, it's possible to positively identify the tree mentioned there as a horse chestnut. He said that he mentioned the five-fold leaves. The sticky buds of the horse chestnut do open early in the spring. The tree is one of the first of any British species to open out. In April, the 5 or 7 leaflets that make up the adult leaves are already fully extended. The multitude blossoms come later, from May to June. When fully in bloom, the horse chestnut resembles a many branching candelabrum, hence the name candle tree is sometimes used.
And then he says something about the Victorian aspect of chestnut trees, which I had never heard of. He says the Sunday before Ascension Day became known as Chestnut Sunday, and young and old alike would wander through Kew Gardens or the London parks, wondering at the beauty of the horse chestnut trees. Now, of course, the chestnut, particularly in the States, most of the chestnuts were wiped out in a blight, I think, in the 50s and in the 60s. And they've started to come back. I know there was recently a story in the New York Times about planting chestnut trees. So apparently, there's some focused effort to restoring the absence of chestnut trees. But Jewel says, by the way, he says the horse chestnut was not native to Britain. It arrived sometime in the 16th century, probably from somewhere in Iran or Greece or Bulgaria, and we don't really know, the derivation of the common name. There were studies during World War II in an effort to come up with alternative sources of feed for livestock, and those, he says, determined that while you might get sheep to eat horse chestnuts, horses can't stand horse chestnuts. And it may be that the horse part of the name was only supposed to indicate the coarseness of the nut. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. And then he says, this chestnuts roasting on the open fire thing, this is a completely different variety. That is Castanea sativa. And it's called the sweet chestnut, sometimes referred to as Italian, Spanish, French, or just European. And the nut resembles that of the horse chestnut in appearance only. And the trees are really different in most respects.
And then as we get to Wisteria Lodge, which we mentioned before, Jewel says that since Watson didn't mention anything about the chestnuts that line the gloomy avenue there in The Adventure of Wisteria Lodge, the species cannot be determined with any certainty. And he says that with the occupants named Garcia, it would certainly be tempting to treat the Wisteria Lodge trees as Spanish chestnuts, but they were probably not. And he goes on to mention the Village Blacksmith by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that began with the line, "Under the spreading chestnut tree, the village smithy stands." And he mentions that blight then that you had mentioned before. But for Watson, chestnut meant horse chestnut.
Oh, interesting. Well, and then Don takes us to behind 221B Baker Street. He says, no doubt the most venerable tree in the Canon was the one that grew at 221B. Watson described it in Thor Bridge. It was a wild morning in October, he wrote, and I observed as I was dressing how the last remaining leaves were being whirled from the solitary plane tree which graces the yard behind our house. And Don says, no doubt this was a London plane, Plantanus acerifolia, or acarifolia, a cross between the Oriental plane and the American plane, widely planted in London and other large cities because of its resistance to smoke and soot.
Now that is a hardy tree, not a laurel tree, a hardy tree. You know, I've lived in or stayed in places where there is, kind of a, not necessarily a yard, but maybe a courtyard out the back windows. Usually doesn't have incredible access to light, and usually it's limited in terms of the fertilization that it'll get. And I don't know about you, Bert, but between hearing or reading about these leaves being whipped off the plane tree and knowing that it has to survive among smoke and soot, I've always pictured the plane tree in the backyard of Baker Street to be something akin to the Charlie Brown Christmas tree. That could just be me, though.
No, I think that's right. The poor plane tree, I mean, particularly on Baker Street, in those days, you can imagine the backyards being getting darker and darker as the houses grew, perhaps a little bit bigger, and around them. Very sad. Sad to be a tree in the city.
It was just a plain tree.
Yeah.
So then we move on to some of the evergreens here. As, we get into pines and needles. The larch, it's lumped together with the pine in Study in Scarlet, which Jefferson Hope and the Ferriers came upon. And incidentally, Lucy Ferrier had chestnut hair, as it was described in A Study in Scarlet. So there's another nod to the chestnut. So yeah, we've got a bunch of different kinds of larches. None of them grow anywhere near Salt Lake City or Carson City. And then he mentions that one would expect to find a cedar of Lebanon growing on holy soil. The tree is often mentioned in the Bible. Its wood is said to be that from which the cross of Jesus was constructed. Perhaps Watson is thinking of the fact that when he refers to Neville Sinclair's house as the Cedars in The Man with the Twisted Lip, the same case opens with Watson setting off to rescue Isa Whitney, brother of the late Elias Whitney, principal of the Theological College of St. George's. It's all circular.
Yeah. And it's interesting, just right before he gets to the Cedars, he has this little observation here about the European larch. He says, the Larix decidua, the European larch, was introduced to England in the early 17th century. And because it was, weather resistant and water resistant, most Venetian residences rest on larch pilings. Now, I knew that, that basically the city of Venice sits on pilings pounded, into that swampy water. But he says then there was encouraged cultivation of the larch as a commercial venture in England, and then the larch became popular as a churchyard ornament, which it shared with the cedar and the yew. None of which I had ever heard of that. That's interesting. But back to the cedars, he says, the cedar of Lebanon probably arrived in England from France sometime during the 17th century. And how that happened, is a matter of interest. It appears that a traveler brought a seedling with him by using his hat as a flower pot.
Oh, all of the uses for top hats. That's one I haven't heard of before.
Yeah, no, I can't. Can you imagine that fellow, just sort of sitting there on the boat going back home?
Right.
May I take your hat, sir? No, it's fine.
Yeah.
No, I'll just keep it here on my lap.
Yeah. And he says, unfortunately, the common name cedar was also used to describe other plants, like the junipers, for instance, which did not belong to the genus Cedrus. If only Watson had jotted down the name of Sinclair's gardener. The problem of shared common names is that Watson also ran into this when he mentioned the fir. Throughout recorded history, the name fir has been bestowed upon a variety of unrelated conifer species, including pines. And we know Watson was not a botanist himself, so would have been oblivious to this era. And then Jewell goes on to name, the grand fir as the Alba grandis, the silver fir, and then notes that when we get to Furbank Villas, 13 Furbank Villas, Dr. Horsham resided and or kept his offices there in the disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax. The silver or grand firs may have stood together near the fence at Percy Phelps's Briarbrae house in the Naval Treaty. Holmes used them to screen his clandestine entrance into the grounds. But he says the more likely choice is the Scotch fir. It's not indigenous to southern England, but the tree is very common. It's often called the most important British coniferous tree. It's also not a fir at all, but a pine. And today the name Scots pine is applied, but Holmes and Watson would have called it the Scotch fir.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
Points out, Don too points out, two of the trees on Hampstead Heath's Firs Avenue, depicted in 1820 by John Constable, survive today. And the black-green needles of the Scots pine appear in pairs, unlike those of true firs. And he says in the yellow face, Grant Monroe finds the plantation next door to be the perfect place to unwind after a difficult day in town. And he explains to Holmes how trees are always a neighborly kind of thing. And he refers to the Scots pines specifically as Scotch firs. And then we're into the Hound of the Baskervilles. He says Watson may have been thinking about the same tree when he described the stunted oaks and firs which had been twisted and bent by the fury of years of storm in the Hound. The Scots pine was commonly encountered on Dartmoor, possibly the hardiest tree in Britain. It was able to survive the unpredictable Devon climate, and the trunks of the old trees were frequently twisted and gnarled. Long associated with Druid cemetery ceremonies, the trees in Dartmoor are all stunted, and occasional mountain ash or holly may find its way in. But by and large, the pedunculate oak, Quercus robur, predominates. There are no fir trees in Wistman's Woods in Dartmoor. Interesting, really interesting.
And then, of course, we find ourselves in also in the Hound of the Baskervilles in the yew alley with yew trees.
Oh, right.
The yews. Actually, he said yews grow wild in the Lake District and the Chalk Downs of Surrey and Sussex. I thought the yews were also native to New Jersey.
Yeah, yews would think so.
Hey, yews, over here. But yeah, it's the trees, of course, stood silent at witnessing the final demise of Charles Baskerville. They said the two lines of old yew hedge, 12 feet high and impenetrable. So they must have been planted fairly close together and then, of course, trimmed over the course of their lives to form a hedge. Notably, not a shrubbery.
We want a shrubbery!
Oh, goodness. Now we're in trouble.
No, not at all. And then Don just observes along the way here about yews that the yews basically what happened was that the wood of the yew tree was ideal for constructing longbows. And when the longbow was the national weapon of England, the yew itself became a national resource protected by royal decree. Cultivation of the tree was encouraged. Fascinating. And I had absolutely no idea that, that was an aspect of this particular tree's history. Fascinating.
Fascinating. And I shall not taunt you a second time. So that means that this and everything we've just talked about is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Copper beeches, Mr. Rucastle.
Oh, dead, Miss Hunter. Mostly dead.